My name is Sarah Brylinski, and I'm the Program Associate at Second Nature, the lead supporting organization of the American College and University President's Climate Commitment. We have a great lineup of speakers today to talk about Scope 3, or indirect emissions, and we'll be covering how colleges and universities can keep an eye to the future to expand their Scope 3 emissions reporting beyond the ACU PCC requirements by looking at the updated Scope 3 protocol from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. We'll also be learning about some new tools for reporting in the soon-to-be-released web-based campus carbon calculator from Clean Air, Cool Planet, and then hear about some of the practical implications of doing that expanded reporting from New College of Florida. So I have a couple of our presenters on the line here. Let me unmute them so that they can say hello. Joining us today are Ben Buckley, Research Analyst from the Greenhouse Gas Initiative Climate and Energy Program at the World Resources Institute. Ben, you can say hello.
Hello, everyone.
We also have Jenn Andrews, the Director of Program Planning and Coordination from Clean Air, Cool Planet.
Good afternoon.
And Jono Miller, the campus steward and Assistant to the Vice President for Finance and Administration at New College of Florida.
Hi, it's great to be with you. We escaped Isaac, and someday we'll have to talk about natural disaster implications on campus footprints.
We're glad that you could be with us, Jono. I'm very glad that you didn't get bowled under this weekend. So before we get started with Ben, I would just want to go over a few logistics. All attendees will be on mute for the entire presentations, and we'll be saving the question and answer until the end of all three presentations, but you're encouraged to submit your questions at any time throughout the presentation. And you can do that by using the question feature in your GoToWebinar panel. If you have a question for a specific presenter, please make sure you include their name when you submit the question, and you can do that at any time. I'll be aggregating the questions, and we'll have them lined up at the end for the Q&A. And both today's PowerPoint and a recording of the presentation will be available after the event on the ACU PCC website, and it'll also be sent out in an email to you. So if you'd like to forward that to others or review this at any other time, if you need to leave early, you'll have the link to do so. So let's get started. First, we have Ben Buckley. Ben is a research analyst at the World Resources Institute, and he's working on the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Initiative. He was previously a senior research analyst at TrueCost, an environmental research consultancy based in London. Ben holds a master's degree in environmental technology from Imperial College London, where he focused on business and the environment, as well as a bachelor's degree in biology from the University of Manchester. Ben, welcome.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you all for joining us. So as Sarah said, I work for the World Resources Institute. We're a non-profit environmental think tank based in Washington, D.C. And I work on the GHG protocol team there, and I'll say a bit more about GHGP in a moment. Next slide, please. So just quickly run through what I'm gonna talk about to start you off. I'm going to give a quick overview of what the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is and what Scope 3 emissions are. I'm not going to spend too much time on that, as I think you're fairly familiar with some of the concepts. Then talk about how the Scope 3 is relevant to your institutions, and then a few tips on getting started and setting targets. Next. So as I mentioned, World Resource Institute is an environmental think tank. And the Greenhouse Gas Protocol was an initiative launched by the World Resource Institute in partnership with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development back in the late 90s. And the idea was to develop a framework for organizations to use when measuring and reporting their greenhouse gas emissions. So organizations, companies, and so on were starting to measure these emissions, but weren't quite sure what the standard framework should be. So we got together and we developed some standards that companies could use and guidance and tools to go along with it. And this is actually where the terminology Scope 1, 2, and 3 originated from. And the Scope 1 and 2 standard was released about 10 years ago now, actually. And as you can see from the slide here, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol's mission is essentially to lay a foundation for measurement and management of greenhouse gases, so that everyone is using the same framework, the same terminology, and so on, so that organizations and companies and so on can start competing on greenhouse gas reductions and so on. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the original standard that the Greenhouse Gas Protocol released addressed direct emissions and emissions from electricity, so Scope 1 and 2 emissions. And then actually last year, the Scope 3 standard was released, which looks at essentially all other types of emissions. And the Scope 3 standard breaks up Scope 3 emissions into 15 different categories, which are all listed on the slide you can see there, from purchased goods and services right through to franchises and investments and so on. We'll actually go through and talk in a bit more detail in a minute about each of those categories and how they might be relevant to a higher education institution. But that just gives you a broad overview of what we mean by Scope 1, 2, and 3. Next, please. So as companies have become more sophisticated in measuring their Scope 1 and 2 emissions over the last 10 years or so, it's become clear that just looking at the direct emissions and the emissions from electricity, Scope 1 and 2, was not really giving organizations the full picture of their effect on climate change. It actually became apparent that a huge amount of the emissions can be associated with other indirect impacts in their value chain, both upstream and downstream. This is a diagram taken from the road testing that we did for the Scope 3 standard. So when we developed the standard, we had about 30 companies who actually carried out a Scope 3 inventory on a draft of the guidance and calculated their emissions from all of their Scope 3 categories. So this is an aggregate of all of those road testers. And obviously there'll be a big difference between some of the companies involved, but you can see in general that Scope 1 and 2 emissions counts for a relatively small part of the total impact of the average organization. And that will be true certainly for higher education institutions as well. So the idea was to develop a standard that companies could use or other organizations could use to look at their Scope 3 emissions in a standardized manner, as they had been doing with Scope 1 and 2. Next, please. So as we'd hoped with the release of the Scope 3 standard at the end of last year, it really sort of catalyzed a lot of interest in this field of indirect GHG emissions, and Scope 3 was sort of touted as a trend to watch, if you like, in 2012 and going forward, now that there is finally a sort of standardized framework for companies to use. And you've got other organizations like the Carbon Disclosure Project, which I would have thought a lot of you will have heard of at least, who are also starting to ask more and more questions of their companies on supply chain issues and Scope 3 issues. Next. So as I said, companies are also already relatively familiar with Scope 1 and 2 emissions, and now we're starting to broaden that out and to look at all sorts of Scope 3 emissions. So we'll go through the list now one by one and look at what might be relevant to a higher education organization, and what might be involved in what business activities might be involved there. And then when we come to the Q&A, we can discuss in more depth any questions that you have. Next, please. So before we go through the list, it's probably worth mentioning that a few of these are already being measured by any ACU PCC members. Categories 5, 6, and 7 on the list that you can see there, waste, business, travel, and employee commuting, are at least in part already being measured and disclosed as part of your commitments. So there are already some Scope 3 elements to the reporting that's already being done. So it'd be a case of building off of what you've already got there. So if we go through the list quickly, so purchased goods and services would certainly be a category that's relevant, which you can remember from the slide before, but purchased goods and services is often found to be one of the more significant Scope 3 categories for the average organization. It obviously depends exactly what the activities are of the organization, but this would include any purchased items, really, food, office supplies, other materials. One that I also wanted to mention is purchase water, so the purchasing of potable water and the emissions associated with making that water potable in the first place could be accounted for in scope 3 category 1. I wanted to mention that because I know it's something that Jono is going to touch on in his presentation in a bit, so I just wanted to flag that here, and perhaps we can discuss further later on. So capital goods again would certainly be relevant to a higher education institution. That could include, for example, research equipment. Certainly construction of new buildings and facilities could be a very significant part of the scope 3 inventory for a higher education institution. And then fuel and energy related activities, which is category 3, would certainly be relevant as well. Jenn might be able to help me on this later on, but I think that transmission and distribution losses are already calculated as part of or within the carbon calculator. So you can maybe touch on that later. So that's part of your scope 3 category 3. And the other things that would be captured here would be the full upstream emissions of any fuels or energy sources that the organizations are using. So the idea behind this one really is that you can start to distinguish between fuels that are not only lower carbon when you burn them, but also lower carbon in producing them. So for example, fuels that are derived from unconventional sources such as tar sands would have higher upstream emissions that would be reflected in your scope 3 category 3. So it just helps organizations understand the full impact of the fuels that they're using across their full life cycle. Again, transportation distribution could certainly be relevant, and although perhaps would be a smaller element than some of the others. For example, buying local would reduce emissions from the purchase of all the elements that are reflected in category 1, so the purchase of food, purchase of office supplies, and so on. I'll skip over the next 3 as we've already touched on those, and again we can probably come back to any questions you have on any of this later on. So next slide, please. So as you can see from the last slide, a lot of the upstream categories of scope 3 emissions are probably relevant to a higher education institution. That's not necessarily the case with a lot of the downstream emissions, or downstream categories, sorry. One that is not relevant in terms of a quantitative emissions number that would be reported, but could be of interest, was this use of sold products category. Now, we discussed this a bit and thought of perhaps ideas around how the students themselves are the products of the university, and there could be some sort of qualitative metrics around career paths of graduates and the sort of sustainability literacy of graduates and their knowledge of climate change and so on that could be reported in terms of what they're going on to do in their careers. It could be an interesting idea to explore, but as I said, wouldn't result in a figure of tons of carbon dioxide, of course. So not many of the other ones are relevant. The only other one to mention is investments, which is category 15. And a university or college's endowment fund would be included in that investments category and could be a very significant source of emissions. So looking at the size of some of the endowments, there could be a potential significant source of emissions there. If you're looking at your ownership of the companies that you're investing in and what their emissions are, you could end up with a very large number in that section. As with all of these categories, there's guidance in the Scope 3 standards and in the accompanying Scope 3 calculation guidance document, both of which are available on our website. There's guidance on calculating all of these. But I did want to mention a specific point about investments. I know this was of particular interest to some of the colleges. Next slide, please. GHG Protocol is actually considering doing some additional work on the investments category with the financial services sector, so that companies can get a better idea of how they're supposed to report their emissions from investments. And we're actually in the scoping phase of that project at the moment, so we're going to be approaching a number of financial institutions to get their input into this, and to find out a bit more about how they can be involved, and what additional guidance we can provide to companies to report emissions from investments. I know that's something that Sarah and her team are very interested in, and we will be keeping her posted on the development of this project. So if you would like to be kept abreast of those developments, you can either email me or Sarah, and we can add you to the mailing list for the development of that project, and we can perhaps get some input from universities on how they would account for emissions from endowments. But that's a work in progress, not applicable at the moment. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to very, very briefly touch on a couple of the elements of the Scope 3 standard. I'm not going to go through in detail the steps required to report Scope 3 emissions. That's available in the Scope 3 standard, which can be downloaded from the web address shown there. The chapters of the standard sort of take you through step by step each step of the process. And I said there's an accompanying calculation guidance document which actually has calculation formulas and emission factors and emission factor references and examples of calculations and so on for each of the 15 categories. So that might be a useful resource for you as well when you come to calculate emissions. There's a draft available on the website at the moment, and we'll be releasing the final version of that calculation guidance in the next couple of months. Next slide, please. So yeah, you can press down all of the. I didn't realize it was animated. Sorry. And one more. Yeah. Okay. Great. Sorry about that. So just one of the key points around doing a Scope 3 inventory really is this idea that you want to be including all of your significant sources of Scope 3 emissions. Now, carrying out a Scope 3 inventory can be quite overwhelming. There's 15 categories of emissions. It sounds all quite complicated. And we're not necessarily expecting organizations to calculate emissions for each of those 15 categories. But the idea really is to make sure that nothing significant or relevant is excluded. So next slide, please. That's great, thanks. So yeah, so one of the first steps to working out what is significant is mapping out the value chain, so understanding what business activities are actually involved in the full value chain of the university or college. So what's being purchased, from who, what transportation services are being purchased, what capital goods are being purchased, and so on. What emissions might be associated with any downstream categories. And then next slide, please. And then the idea would be to carry out a sort of a screening step. So once you know what the activities are, using secondary data to calculate some estimates of where your priority sectors and priority categories might be. So for example, it might be found that your purchase goods and services is a priority category, so you want to start engaging with more of your suppliers of food products and other supplies to actually collect more accurate data for those. And again, it's the idea just to prioritize your efforts, so you're spending the most time on the Scope 3 categories that offer the most opportunities for emissions reductions. Next slide. And the idea again is that this is an iterative process. So Scope 3 can be quite complex, but the idea is to carry out a screening to prioritize your efforts onto the high priority areas at first, and then develop and improve data quality over time. And that could be over a number of years. It might not be that an organization can carry out a full Scope 3 inventory in the first year it attempts to do so, but it would be like a staged approach, might be more relevant. Next. I just want to say a very brief thing about scope, about reduction targets, sorry, before I finish up. Now obviously the ultimate target for the colleges and universities is this climate neutrality goal that's been set. And then I think we're going to probably discuss a bit more in the discussion section around the implications of adding Scope 3 emissions to a climate neutrality target. I'm not sure how that's going to be dealt with. Perhaps Jenn can help answer that question when she speaks. But in terms of setting some maybe interim targets for reaching your goals and for tracking progress and so on, it might be relevant to set some individual targets for individual Scope 3 categories, for example, or perhaps a target that just looks at Scope 3 rather than Scope 1 and 2. Obviously, the final aim is an absolute reduction in Scope 1, 2, and 3. But there all sorts of interim targets could be set to help focus attention. And then just in sort of a very high-level idea of what the different types of target setting can be. So we have this sort of top-down approach or this bottom-up approach. Bottom-up really looks at, once you've carried out your Scope 3 inventory and you've identified some reduction opportunities, really sort of adding those up and working out what you can achieve. We call that sort of a bottom-up approach. And then there's the top-down approach, which sort of sets more of a stretch goal. So you set an ambitious target that you're not quite sure how you're going to meet, and then that will drive some creative thinking and so on from the organization. Good example of an organization that's done that actually is Walmart, who set itself a target of eliminating 20 million tons of CO2 from its supply chain by 2015, which was a stretch target that didn't know how it's going to meet. And it's now scrambling to meet that, but I'm sure it will meet it, and it will probably come up with some great new methods of reducing GHG emissions in the process. Next slide. So that's what I'm going to say at this point. Please submit any questions you have now, and we'll answer them at the end. And I'll now pass over to Jenn to talk about the carbon calculator.
Thanks, Ben. And I'm going to introduce Jenn here in just a minute, but I actually wanted to go back, Ben, to your last slide and make a comment for the folks on the webinar who are ACU PCC signatories. If you're not yet at the stage where you've submitted a progress report on your climate action plan, you should be aware that 2 years after you've created a climate action plan and you have to submit a progress report on that climate action plan, you are required to set interim targets towards your goal of climate neutrality. So you're required to set a target date for climate neutrality and some interim targets of combined Scope 1, 2, and 3. But what was interesting in this first year of progress reports, which were submitted in January of 2012, was that many people chose to set interim targets, additional interim targets, just for Scope 3. A couple of people did Scope 1 interim targets, but a lot of people did Scope 3. And I think that we can talk more about that during the discussion, but I think the reason for that is that folks are trying to get a handle on things like setting some short-term goals for solid waste or commuting, where they have a lot of active student programming as well. So something interesting to keep in mind. If you have any questions about that or thoughts or comments for the discussion period, submit those or save them to the end. So now we have Jenn Andrews, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. She's a tremendous resource and helpful individual to know if you work on greenhouse gas inventories on campus. Jenn Andrews is the Director of Program Planning and Integration at Clean Air, Cool Planet, and among her other responsibilities, Jenn's role at CACP is to advise schools across the U.S. on how to measure and manage their greenhouse gas emissions. She directs the development and support of the Campus Carbon Calculator, and she oversees Clean Air, Cool Planet's Climate Fellows program, and she also works closely with campus sustainability leaders across the country to share resources and strategies on supporting campus climate neutrality. So Jenn, thank you so much for being here. Take it away.
Thanks, Sarah. I appreciate it. And thank you, Ben, too, for kind of setting the stage. The work of WRI has been so instrumental, so formative for the carbon accounting industry. And it's thanks in a large part to WRI programs that I think we've all been able to make as much progress as we have. And of course, that also certainly goes for the ACU PCC and for Second Nature. So thanks, Sarah, for organizing this webinar. As noted, I'm the Director of Program Planning at Clean Air, Cool Planet, and many of you probably already know we're a nonprofit organization that for more than a decade has been working with colleges and universities, with local governments, and with businesses on what we like to think of as practical solutions to climate change. And in all of our work with higher ed, that starts, well, really in all of our work with all of our partners, that starts with measuring and tracking. And so we're probably best known in the higher ed space for the campus carbon calculator, which was developed in accordance, well, it has evolved, I should say, in accordance with the greenhouse gas protocol, certainly. Many of you know that this tool started out as the template that was developed and used by one university, by the University of New Hampshire, to do one of the first published campus carbon inventories in the country. And we took that template and brought it to a handful and then a couple dozen schools here in the Northeast that were really kind of delving into these issues and improved upon it based on their feedback, put it up on our website in 2004 where schools across the country began to use it and give us feedback, and of course have worked closely with the ACU PCC and with Second Nature since it got the ACU PCC off the ground to support schools in this effort. It's been really exciting to be working on this issue over the last decade, and we've seen both the carbon accounting industry and of course the campus sustainability movement really building momentum and growing in sophistication. And we can go to the next slide, please, Sarah. With that increased sophistication and, you know, the sort of practice we've all gotten in kind of trying to wrap our heads around the question of our institutional carbon footprints, one of the things we've learned is how much more we have to learn. And a relatively recent, over the past year, analysis by researchers at Carnegie Mellon looked at the reports available on the ACU PCC website and others publicly available, the greenhouse gas inventory reports, and they found that there were quote-unquote countless errors and problems. And many of you are probably familiar with some of these challenges, inconsistency in boundaries, for example, and so a problem with sort of comparing inventory to inventory because folks have different campuses, and so they're measuring different things. Unit conversions can cause headaches. Figuring out how to do indirect emissions from utilities can certainly cause headaches or questions in terms of which grid mix you're sort of looking at. And of course, the biggest headaches, as we all know, often come from these Scope 3 sources. And so that's one of the things that we've long worked to help schools address, kind of figuring out how to apply that greenhouse gas protocol methodology, the Scope 1 and 2 methodology, but increasingly looking at how to do Scope 3 sources as well. If we go to the next slide, this is perhaps a little obvious, but of course with all of those consistencies and challenges, what we can ultimately end up with are inaccurate benchmarks, less strategic decisions than we would like, and less than optimal ability to track progress over time. So of course these are challenges that we're all looking at solving. And those of you that have used the calculator for a while know that it's continually evolving. We're constantly working to incorporate the latest science, the most updated emissions factors, and as many Scope 3 sources as we can based on the available science and also the demand of our users. And the latest evolution of the tool is one that we're very excited about. Sarah alluded to it. We think that it will help address many of these concerns. If we go to the next slide, that is bringing the tool from the crazy Excel spreadsheet format that it's in now, that you all know and love, to a web-based platform, which we're very excited about. And among other things, we think that that web-based platform will help improve the accuracy of the input data by actually eliminating the need for unit conversions, by introducing some new quality control elements in sort of real time, and certainly by improving upon the relevance and consistency of Scope 3 methodologies, building on the work of the greenhouse gas protocol that was released last year and on the feedback that we've gotten from you all. And ultimately, because as a web-based platform, it will result in the largest existing database of not only greenhouse gas output information from colleges and universities, but energy and operational inputs from colleges and universities. We think that being able to aggregate and analyze that data will allow increasingly useful benchmarks, trend analysis, and standardization. So we're excited about that. Next slide, please. And this just continues to kind of talk about those benefits. We think that will increase the consistency of overall inventories, enhance the capabilities for outreach to be able to use this information that you're gathering to both from a management perspective and from to communicate with external stakeholders. Again, we are working to integrate features that will promote more rigorous quality control in terms of data, and we do think that aggregating this sort of sector-wide data will illuminate opportunities, and perhaps in no place more important than in these sort of Scope 3 categories. So if we go to the next slide, people, you may wonder what the new tool will look like compared to the old tool. This tool, I should have said, we are just a little over a month away from launching it. It will be available mid-October, starting at the, well, we will be sort of unveiling it at the ACU conference, October 14th. We have a couple of workshops where people can actually create accounts and begin to move their inventory data over into the new version and help us beta test. Ultimately, the web-based calculator will include all of those things that the existing calculator does, the inventory module, but we think it will be a great deal more user-friendly in this web-based platform, again, with more quality control. The projections module, which will allow you to save not just one but multiple projected scenarios for sort of business as usual scenarios. And the solutions module, I'm not sure how many of you are terribly familiar or have used this part of the tool before, but this is the part of the tool that allows you to do kind of cost-benefit analyses of the different strategies you can use to mitigate your carbon footprint, and the online version of the solutions module will allow you to save different combinations or bundles of projects in multiple portfolios. And also integrated in the new tool will be a system for data entry via Teams. You can have multiple users logging into the new system for report management and for integrated user support. So as you can imagine, we're excited about all of this and looking forward to working with you all on it. Now, if we go to the next slide, we can talk a little bit about what this will mean exactly for Scope 3 emissions. So those of you that use the calculator know that currently the Scope 3 sources that are included are emissions from commuting, student, staff, and faculty commuting, from directly financed outsourced travel, study abroad, sending your waste to the landfill or incinerator, the treatment of wastewater, and emissions from purchasing paper. So some of those things, of course, you're required to report as ACU PCC signatories. Some of them are not ACU PCC requirements, but they're things that we've already included in the calculator because folks have asked for help in measuring those things. And the bullet that isn't on the slide that should be, Ben alluded to in his presentation, and that is emissions from the transmission and distribution of electricity. So a little bit of that upstream energy, of course, that's already included in the calculator, as those of you that use it know. If we go to the next slide, you can see that all of those sources, all of those sources will still be included. There's a couple of additions or improve. Yeah, I sort of did that animation backward. I apologize. So what you're seeing now is a screenshot from the web-based version of the calculator. So this is this represents the Scope 3 sources that will be included at the initial launch in October. So all of those same things, again, transportation and distribution will also be included. That's just something that is sort of automatically generated. It's not something that you have to choose to include. Everything else is you can choose whether or not you want to calculate it. And so, Sarah, do you mind probably going back, yeah, thank you. A couple of changes in terms of data collection and input, just to kind of give you a little bit of preview, that we think will help make these particular scope 3 sources a little bit less of a headache. On the commuting side, instead of asking for the % of commuters that use each mode, so currently it says, okay, car, bus, subway, rail, what % of your commuters go by each? The web-based version will ask for the % of total trips that are taken using each mode. So that will allow you to account for the fact that oftentimes people use different modes on different days or even multiple modes on the same day. So this will provide a little bit more flexibility and hopefully accuracy as well. Likewise, to help reduce the headache and create flexibility for air travel, the new web-based version will allow you to not only input miles, which is what the current version does, it will also allow you, alternatively allow you, to calculate emissions from air travel by entering the number of short, medium, and long-haul trips, or the number of dollars spent on air travel, which are other sort of proxy inputs that folks have used in the past. And so instead of having to convert those, you'll be able to just enter them directly. In terms of other scope 3 things that will be in the initial calculator, there will also be more and clearer, we think, documentation and methodology for both wastewater and solid waste. And that will be important because one of the things that has happened in terms of moving from version 6.7 to 6.8 and also to the web-based version is that some of the emissions factors for solid waste especially, which we get from the EPA, have changed pretty significantly. And so giving you that clear documentation, I think, will be, and a clear methodology, I think, will be helpful in understanding the changes that result to your emissions profiles. And updated factors for office paper as well, which some of you have been tracking and sort of falls into that purchased goods category. So if we go to the next slide. Yeah, there we go. Those were the things that will be in the version that will be launched in October. We have some other sort of short-term priorities on our sort of punch list for Scope 3. And they relate back to some of the things that Ben talked about. Some of you may be familiar with our Chef's tool, which is currently online in beta format. And one of the things that we're looking at doing once we get the calculator web-based version launched is combining it with the Chef's tool, which allows you to calculate the emissions from your dining services, so food purchases, water purchases, purchases from goods related to dining. All of those things are quantified using this Chef's tool, and we want to kind of integrate Chef's with the calculator so that you get a full life cycle picture of the impact of dining services that you can use, you can incorporate into your greenhouse gas inventory, or you could sort of look at it as a standalone thing. So that's a short-term priority, and those of you that get the ACU PCC Implementer newsletter may have seen or will soon see an article written by 2 of our chef's pilot schools who worked with us just over this past summer to try to wrap their heads around exactly that, the impact of their food purchases, which was a very interesting exercise, and we certainly welcome participation in that exercise by others moving forward. Some of the other things, like I say, on our short list are looking at the other upstream impacts from energy uses. So, you know, fugitive emissions from natural gas have been a big conversation as of late for good reason. There's interesting new science around that. So that and other upstream impacts. Investments, as Ben mentioned, that's something that more and more kind of divestment campaigns are beginning to get some traction on campuses, and we're definitely hearing from our users that they'd like to see that included, and so we're definitely looking at how to include that in the future. And the 2 other high priority categories from our perspective are emissions from construction and demolition and from information technology. So those are things we'll be paying attention to moving forward. And if we go to the next slide. Some additional advanced features in development. I won't spend a ton of time on them now. I think you'll all have access to these slides after the fact. Hopefully you'll all get to come to our AC workshop so you can hear more about these then. But we are planning a lot of kind of advanced features to be built off of this web-based platform, which we think will be helpful and we're excited about. Not the least of which is looking at how we can streamline submission of the inventory results to the different reporting systems like the ACU PCCs and AC stars. If we go to the next slide, which should be the last one, just a little bit on timeline. So you can visit our website with campuscarbon.org to see a few screenshots to see this sort of peer school comparison tool that was developed by the Carnegie Mellon researchers to help choose sort of quote-unquote appropriate schools against which to benchmark your emissions. You can register to attend our ACU workshop. We'll be doing beta testing of the new inventory module from mid-October to the end of the year, and working with as many of you as possible to migrate your data from your spreadsheets to the new web-based version. In parallel with that, we'll be working on development of the online projections and solutions module. So an ambitious and exciting timeline, and we look forward to working with you all more on it. And I'm going to wrap it up from there and hand it over to Jono. Thank you.
Thanks, Jen. And just a friendly reminder, if you have any questions for Jen Andrews about the online campus calculator or about greenhouse gas reporting with the tools, please submit those questions now and just include her name if it's something specific for Jen. And next up we have Jono Miller. So Jono is an environmental educator and an activist who graduated from Florida's New College in 1974. He currently works for New College's vice president on matters pertaining to campus management, including greenhouse gas emissions. And Jono has a great title for himself. He calls himself the campus steward, and he's really interested in off-campus implications of campus actions. So welcome, Jono. Thanks for being here.
Well, thank you, Sarah. It is exciting to be here. As you mentioned, we're a small liberal arts college on the Gulf Coast of Florida. And if you go to the next slide, we started looking at 9 different Scope 3 categories. Of course, 5 of those deal with commuting and travel, so they sort of collapse. You can go on. Yeah, so that's what we looked at, and what we found, if you go to the next slide, is a lot of these are pretty straightforward. And I'll talk about 4 of them: the transmission and distribution losses, commuting, air travel, and solid waste. And in contrast, we found several that were problematic. If you look at the next slide, we're having some trouble with our wastewater and paper, and it's great to hear Jen coming to the rescue and providing more tools to look at those. So let's go ahead and look at the next slide. You can go ahead. All right, so transmission and distribution losses for purchased electricity. The Clean Air Cool Planet calculator handles this very readily. You just put in your eGrid location and it crunches the numbers. So that was very straightforward. Next. Commuting, the way we've been handling that for faculty and staff, we're a residential college, so most all of our students live here on campus. And we looked at the parking permits. We redesigned our parking permit to include zip code information. We sort of create a center for that zip code and assign everybody in that zip code the same travel distance, and then use surveys to try to come up with some numbers on the frequency with which people travel. Some faculty that live within bicycling distance of campus come frequently. Other faculty try to arrange their schedule so they're only here several days a week. So that worked out pretty well. Next slide. Travel, both primarily air travel. We just looked at receipts and invoices, and we're able to calculate the dollar figure for that. Go ahead. And then solid waste, we also use receipts from the tipping fees at our landfill. So that was very straightforward. Next. The ones that we found to be more problematic included wastewater and paper. And 2 that we're concerned about that we didn't try to report on are municipal water supply and phosphate fertilizer, and I'll talk about both of those. Go ahead. So wastewater is problematic for reasons that should be pretty obvious, at least here in Florida. Sewage is not metered. And so you usually end up calculating the different factors that municipal water supply systems use to bill you for the water you use, and there's a presumption that a certain percentage of that is used for sewage. But in fact, we don't actually know. A lot of our irrigation on campus is not in-ground permanent irrigation, but is supplemental irrigation for landscaping around buildings during drought periods. So that just comes off a hose bib, and that water is not metered. So we really don't know how much of our water is going down drains to the sewage treatment plant and how much is being used for irrigation. Next. Paper, the calculator only asks for what's called uncoded free sheet. This took quite a bit of work going through invoices. A lot of different departments on campus order their own paper, and that made things problematic. And we found that a lot of our offices are choosing not to buy recycled content paper because of the cost considerations. Next. But obviously, there's a lot of paper, other paper that's moving through campus. And you can see the list there from Post-it notes to toilet paper, junk mail. And the admissions office, even though we're a small school, creates a tremendous amount of paper material. We have an online presence, but we're still using a lot of paper and getting the word out about the college. Next. So, as Ben mentioned, one of the things we've been intrigued with is the greenhouse gas implications of our water supply. And these next three slides deal with a single report from the NRDC that looked at California water supply. And of course, in Southern California, a lot of that water is coming from great distances over mountains. But in this slide, you'll see that residential use in Southern California was equal to about 1/3 of the total average household use in the region. Next. This is another way they cut it. They looked at combined water, potable water systems, and wastewater systems in the U.S. and concluded it's about 3% of the U.S. annual electricity consumption. Next. And finally, the California water agencies account for about 7% of California's energy consumption. So water really, in some cases, can be a big issue related to energy. Next. Now, what we're trying to do is switch from using highly treated potable water for irrigation to on-campus wells. And that would be much better. It avoids all that cost of treatment and pumping. But ironically, if we run pumps on campus to pull water from a well, that gets factored into our carbon calculations, but all the costs associated with purchasing water haven't been factored in yet. So it was great to hear Jenn talk about, both Jenn and Ben mentioned a focus on this sort of thing. So that's going to be great. Next. This is a picture of a Central Florida phosphate mining area. It's a lot like mountaintop removal, except that we don't have any mountains here in Florida. And I think it's obvious from this picture that there's a lot of energy expended in extracting the phosphate matrix from the ground. So for those campuses that are using phosphate fertilizer, we don't here on our campus. But for campuses that do use phosphate fertilizer, something you might want to look at is the upstream implications of that portion of your fertilizer. Next. Now, something we found that was really interesting is that really the biggest, for our campus, the biggest implication for our carbon footprint comes from our electricity use. And the students on campus, I think, were fairly progressive in voting to assess themselves a $1 green fee for the equivalent of a credit hour. And let's go to the next slide to see what they voted to fund in the first year. They have a loaner bike program. These are not painted bikes that are abandoned around campus, but you sign them out and you can use them for several weeks, and then if you still need them, you can sign them out again. Overhaul of our recycling and composting with some new compost bins and more accessible composting containers for students, some more Energy Star efficient equipment in our cafe, clotheslines in the residence halls to help us to reduce dryer use, and some water bottle filling stations to try and reduce the use of throwaway plastic bottles on campus. Next. But if you look at these, all of them are sustainable, but none of them is really going to make a big bite in our purchased electricity. Obviously, using dryers less and Energy Star appliances are helpful, but they really don't address that massive 2/3 electric component that we're dealing with. Next. Or I guess just go back, I'm sorry. So one of the things we're really curious about is whether other campuses are seeing a similar sort of disconnect between student interest and what they regard as sustainability and our president's commitment to reducing our carbon footprint, and to what extent those things align and to what extent they separate. And I guess I'll stop now and just remind you, if you have questions, you can type them in and Sarah will be fielding those.
All right. Thanks, Jono. Let me just take a minute to unmute the other presenters. If you have any questions for anyone or general questions about this topic, now's the time to submit them. I have gotten a couple of great questions as we've been going through, so we're going to get started with the Q&A while you submit the rest of your questions. A couple of people were asking questions. Ben, we're going to start off with you about the testing methodology for the greenhouse gas protocol, and this is an area that both you and I can clarify on a little bit. But several people asked if any colleges and universities were involved in helping to review the updated Scope 3 standard, and whether campuses will be involved in some of the future protocol projects going forward.
That's a good question. I'm not sure any campuses were involved in the development of the Scope 3 standard. No, I'd have to look through the list of contributors in the book. They certainly weren't on any of the technical working groups. I mean, we were primarily focused on sort of industry, really, for the development of it. I mean, in terms of going forward, any interested stakeholder can certainly be involved, and we'd be delighted to have colleges and universities involved in stakeholder advisory groups for any of the future projects that we work on. For example, the financial sector guidance I mentioned before. Those are open to anyone who can submit comments and join webinars and so on. So it's not that they were excluded specifically. It's just I don't think we had any participation in the last one, as far as I'm aware, anyway.
And I'll just add to that from the ACU PCC perspective. Part of the idea with having the PCC put together 5 years ago was putting together a specific greenhouse gas reporting standard that worked for higher education, because it is a very different industry. And Jen, you can probably chime in on this as well, just based on your experience. You know, if we look, let's see if I can pull up Ben's the 15 categories. So I'm going to go back to that just for us to look at very briefly. But a lot of the categories that we're looking at for Scope 3 with the greenhouse gas protocol is looking at, you know, output of produced products. And higher education doesn't quite work like industry in that sense, although there's kind of this philosophical question of, can we look at students as our produced products, which is where this more difficult and less quantifiable education component comes in for higher education. So some of these are definitely applicable. Let's go back a little further, this one. Some of these are definitely very directly applicable, and some of them you would really have to change the focus or make very specific to make relevant to higher education. So the ACU PCC is always welcome to feedback from campuses about what works and where we want to go in terms of the standards for higher education as a whole. But the greenhouse gas protocol is something that we use to base a more specific reporting standard on for higher education.
Yeah, and I just add to that as well, Sarah, that I'm just looking at the list of contributors at the moment. We had someone from Carnegie Mellon involved, University of Sydney, a couple of other universities, one in China. So there were a few people from universities involved in the development, actually. but not as significantly as corporations, no.
And I would just add very briefly that, one of the things that we're working to do with the campus carbon calculator is sort of take the groundwork laid by the GHG protocol and kind of apply it to higher ed. So to do, Sarah, as you said, kind of give it that sector-specific lens. And since this guidance this was a process over, it just came out last year, so the review process, was relatively recent. I think that's something we can continue to look at how to, apply it.
Right. And I did have a clarifying question from someone asking about the interim targets, so I'll just address that quickly now. When you submit your progress report on your climate action plan, which would be 2 years after you submit your climate action plan, so 4 years into the commitment, the progress report requires that you submit several interim targets for combined scope 1, 2, and 3. So you are welcome to submit other interim targets beyond that requirement and do just an interim target for scope 3 or several different interim targets for different components of scope 3. The possibilities are, as with everything with the PCC reporting, up to what works best for your university. A lot of folks in this first year of submitting progress reports did submit additional interim targets that were specific to a scope 3 area. So it was interesting to see in the fifth year of the commitment, when this first round of progress reports came in, that it seems as though campuses really are focusing on scope 3 as an area that they're doing a little bit more detailed planning around. And this kind of comes back to what Jono was talking about with student involvement, although Jono, in your case, the students were maybe not quite on track with larger institutional greenhouse gas goals. But I think for many people, they're doing some sort of research or student engagement or even, faculty and staff project that allows them to be more strategic or look more closely at their scope 3 goals in particular. I actually want to pull up another slide that Ben had related to that, which was talking about just, assessing what works for you in terms of scope 3 analysis. I think this is the slide, Ben, right, with screening. So I've heard from several campuses in this regard, and Jen, you probably have as well. And someone submitted a question here during the Q&A asking, how can we justify the inclusion of a broader set of scope 3 categories? So that's something that I would like to open up to all of the panelists. But the PCC or my answer to that, just to start us off, is that it's always about what works best for your campus. Obviously, within this broader context of wanting to have a standardized set of reporting data to compare with schools, and as Jen was talking about, we're always working on improving the consistency of our reporting so that we can do that comparison, so that we can move forward as an industry, as higher education. But when it comes to doing this expansion of scope 3 categories, I think it's really about what works best for each campus. So, Jono was talking about some of the regionally specific or campus-specific areas that were of importance to them, and those certainly won't be the same for a community college in Nebraska or the University of California system, or, every campus really has very different geographical and natural resource needs. So as with anything, but particularly with scope 3, I think that the greenhouse gas protocol offers this opportunity to look at your resource inputs or your emission inputs and outputs in a new light, and see if there's areas that either work to really take a full account of your emissions, to open up new opportunities for student engagement. I think there's a number of different possibilities, but I'm interested in what the other panelists have to say about that, about justifying the inclusion of a broader set of scope 3 categories.
Well, Jono, I think it's justified. I guess my concern is we've been asked to set interim and sort of final goals based on scope, on what we've done so far. And if you go back and look at Ben's slide, that at least for corporations, about 3/4 of their total pie chart are these scope 3 emissions. So as we keep adding and refining and becoming more sophisticated in our ability to work backwards and assess these implications, it seems like that's necessarily going to push out our target dates. And we might want to come up with a system where we retain our trajectory and existing dates based solely on what's been accounted for so far, and then create a new line and a new graph that deals with the scope 3 emissions. But it's not clear to me how anyone can really meet their targets if they're now going to find that 2/3 or 3/4 of what they have to deal with hasn't been accounted for so far?
Yeah, I think the targets are definitely, I mean, it's something that that we're all going to have to approach as a sort of iterative process, which, it's helpful that the PCC is set up that way, because we are all learning and the goalposts shift. To go back to the original question just briefly, one thing that occurred to me, the question around how can you justify adding, if I understood it right, it was around how can you justify adding, additional analyses or analyses of additional sources. And Sarah said, they're going to be regional things factors, or, certain things are going to be more relevant for certain campuses, and that's certainly true. Of course, one of the problems is how do you know what are the highest impact categories without having analyzed them, and how do you justify analyzing them if you don't know, right? So chicken and egg. And one of the great ways we have found around that really is working with faculty to tie, research projects or curricula to these sorts of projects. So I talked a little bit about the chef pilot that we've been doing over the past summer, and a couple of our schools were able to justify exploring that at the beginning because it was either something that the students were demanding, or it was because it was an opportunity to get the students involved. And then, they did a sort of initial preliminary analysis, and one of our schools from our first pilot found that just looking at 4 food items that they purchased, their total purchases of tomatoes, hothouse tomatoes, cream cheese, potatoes, and one other product, I don't remember what, ended up being the total life cycle emissions from those products ended up being more than that school's Scope 1 emissions. So of course that then helped, was a clear justification for going further. But I think it's maybe using some of those faculty and student connections can help make that case sometimes.
That's so interesting, Jen, and a couple people responded or just sent in comments at the end of Jono's presentation talking about this question of campus sustainability versus carbon sustainability, or how do you balance kind of student interest and student engagement with real campus goals? And I think that's a really interesting example of one of the beautiful things about having a interested and diversely interested student body at your disposal is that sometimes students can kind of come across a research project or take something in a whole new direction that really opens up new opportunities or opens up new information for the campus, which is why campuses are, providing so much leadership on greenhouse gas emission accounting in the same vein that they are, doing it radically different from campus to campus, which also makes it a bit difficult. So that actually brings me to another great question that someone asked, which was about adding on new reporting new emissions from year to year and how that changes the standard. So the question was, how do we account for the differences from inventory to inventory when we add new categories of emissions? So for example, if we haven't included paper in the past, but we add paper in years to come, doesn't that mean that our comparison becomes a bit of apples to oranges? So this is a question that I get asked a lot with PCC reporting, and Jen, I'm sure the same question comes your way, but maybe Jen, you can take kind of a first stab at answering that question of, adding new components onto emissions over the years.
Yeah, and I'd like Ben to weigh in from a GHG protocol standard in case I don't articulate that clearly, but our approach, which as I understand it is kind of the DHG protocol's approach, is if you're changing your boundaries, then you do update your baseline year, right? So if you're setting a target, you're setting it against a baseline year. If you're changing the boundaries of your inventory, then clearly you're going to need to change your baseline year. So, the short answer is sort of what you would expect. It's kind of a common sense answer. It's, well, you're going to report your progress toward reductions of the emissions that you had previously measured from year to year at the same time that you need to say, and we've measured these additional things, and so our total carbon footprint, to the extent that we're measuring it, now looks like this. So it's a dual message, and that can be, I think, frustrating or occasionally confusing, or we're afraid that it will confuse our stakeholders. We would like to have a simpler message. But, that's in some ways, a chance to have a broader conversation about, what is the end goal. It's not about a particular number. The end goal is to get to 0, right? In zero impact. And so, again, the goalposts are going to move. It's going to be iterative. But you can say we made X progress toward the baseline that we measured previously, and we've begun measuring these new things. So here's what our new baseline looks like.
Yeah, I mean that's pretty much similar to what I would have said. I mean, we do have some guidance in the Scope 3 standards specifically around recalculating base year emissions and when to do it and when not to do it. And there's a few pages of guidance in Chapter 9 of the standard around recalculating base years. So that's a useful resource for people to look at. And from our point of view, I mean, one of the sort of the principles that we sort of the key principles of our Scope 3 standard or any of our GHG reporting standards is completeness. So getting to including more sources of emissions in your inventory is a good thing. You're getting a more complete picture of the full impact of the organization, rather than focusing on some things that you originally measured. And you can still track emissions reductions against the categories that you've already measured, but including more and more categories to get a complete picture is really one of the first goals from our point of view anyway, to get a complete picture of your emissions of carrying out these inventories. So I would say there's as much focus on understanding the full impacts and getting a complete inventory picture as there is on reducing emissions from the specific categories that have been assessed so far, because you don't know what you're missing out on if you haven't measured other categories. So to include as many as possible is an important step to take.
Jono, maybe you could talk briefly again about the process that you went through in deciding which of your expanded Scope 3 areas to look at.
Well, I wish it was more coherent. I think it was a mix of things we thought we could do easily and things that really intrigued us, that we were curious about and wanted to stretch ourselves a little. So if you look there, the commuting, the air travel, we didn't talk about the transmission and distribution losses too much, but a lot of those were solid waste. Those were easy to calculate and helped us meet the minimum requirements for filling in the spreadsheet. But there's been a lot of talk here in this part of Florida about the energy implications of water and the water implications of energy. And so we're especially interested in that question. There's been some analysis done at the University of Florida where they took the recommended protocols for lawn management that came from the extension offices and looked at the carbon implications of those recommendations. And for any campuses that have significant lawns and actually followed those, there's quite a significant impact. Now, a lot of that's already captured because the gasoline in your lawnmowers is covered, et cetera. That fertilizer is mostly covered. But we were just really intrigued with the question of water. And I guess my recommendation to other campuses is that if you live in Southern California or have water that is pumped a great distance or is treated with any high energy technology such as desalinization or possibly reverse osmosis, you're probably going to have some significant or at least measurable energy implications with your water supply. So that was one that simply intrigued us. And we're also kind of stymied by the paper situation. There's just so much paper, even now that we're in the 21st century and so much, I get almost no paper mail at this point. It's all email. But there's still a lot of paper moving through our campus. And we as I said, it's sort of a stretch. We wanted to force ourselves to look more comprehensively at those things.
Thanks, Jono. I just got a great question about messaging, and Jono, this your presentation in particular makes me think it would be great to get each of the panelists to weigh in on this question, which is all of this is fairly technical information, especially when we really start to dive into Scope 3. Ben walked us through briefly, the 15 different categories of emissions, ways that you can look at your indirect emissions. So the question was about messaging. How do we use this as an opportunity to really create valuable messaging for campus about why paying attention to our carbon emissions is important, why climate neutrality is important, and I guess at the greenhouse gas emissions level, why working or looking at these kind of specific areas is a useful and necessary thing for campuses to do. And I think that question can be both educationally and operationally, and it should be for campuses. But I'd be interested to hear from each of the panelists about any messaging tips you have around, using this as a leverage point to make it more attractive and more paid attention to on campus.
Well, I'll start. This is Jono. Operationally, we are getting support from the administration, and I think some of that is sort of pass-through pressure from the state. So it's not simply that our president has signed a climate commitment, but that there are various state agencies that are interested in more accounting of our energy use. We're repeatedly asked by the legislature to report on how we're doing things more efficiently. And so that's helping from the administrative operational point of view. In terms of the students, something that we've tried to get to and haven't really mastered yet is we were hoping to be in a situation where when the students are done collecting the information, and at our campus we use students to gather the information for the calculator, we were hoping to come up with a way to get a series of articles in our student newspaper that would deal with their findings. So they could actually go through and have a brief article about student commuting or deal with solid waste or explain some of these challenges or the real implications of our purchased electricity. I don't know that we simply run out of time or we take the month of January to do that work, but I think if we could get that word out through the student publications about the work that's being done, and not in one big thick report that people can look at online, but in a series of bite-sized manageable articles, I think that would help a lot.
A couple of thoughts. Hopefully they kind of hit at the question. One is the story I told a minute ago about that sort of initial chef's pilot school where just looking at those 4 products, the emissions from those outweighed that of the Scope 1 sources. So, I mean, there was a technical analysis behind that, LCA, life cycle analysis and the emissions factors from the physical plant. But, the bottom line is if you sort of think of it as a visual where the power plant, which everyone sort of associates with pollution and greenhouse gases and climate change, having less of an impact than, breakfast. And if you can think about it in visual ways and use visuals to convey that, I think that helps, and that's something that we worked with at school to try to do. And likewise with chefs, one of the things that we're working to develop to sort of complement the technical kind of quantitative analysis that the computer, the online tool will do, is a labeling system for campuses, and we're actually going to be looking for schools to pilot the labeling system too, to sort of make it more relevant to folks, because it's all well and good to have this great life cycle analysis of your dining services, but if it doesn't change menu planning or individual choices, then who cares, right? So that's sort of one response. The other thing I would say is that, and this is kind of more open-ended or maybe a question as opposed to an answer, but we've been thinking a lot here about how to use mobile technology to begin to do this. So are there mobile apps we could build on top of all these great qualitative tools that would help? Or I mean, social media is something everyone is looking at, but we're trying to figure out if there are also applications. I know a lot of schools have apps of their own. Colleges and universities have apps of their own for various functions, and so maybe there's a way to use those more. I don't know, some ideas, not really great answers, but.
Thanks.
Yeah, that was I would just maybe add like that's always been touched on really, but just providing context to the numbers. So providing the bigger picture of why the presidents and why the universities care about reducing their climate change impact and so on. And then also talking about co-benefits as well, so things that might directly affect the university, like money saving from energy saving programs and so on, that aren't just in mitigating climate change, but also have actual cost-saving benefits or something for the university. And then also just providing, like I think Jenn said, providing visuals on the figures and also relating carbon figures to something more tangible. So, rather than just talking about a number in tons of CO2, maybe relating it to how many cars that is equivalent to taking off the road or something like that. That helps people understand a bit better about what the numbers mean, because tons of carbon is a pretty abstract term to get your head around.
And I think there's always
room
for... Oh, go ahead, Jono.
Well, it just reminded me that I think this visualization stuff and the graphics are really key. One of the things we've been discussing but haven't implemented is putting separate meters on all the dorms and adjusting for the number of students in the dorms, and then having real-time visual monitor displays that show how much electric use is taking place in each dorm. And that's analogous to the experience people have when they get into a Prius or one of the automobiles that is tracking gas consumption in real time. We're used to looking at an electric bill or a water bill as a batch process reporting that we get once a month. And when you provide information to people in real time about how decisions they make each day affect that usage, it really can change behavior. So I think something we all need to be looking at is enabling people to directly experience the day-to-day energy or carbon implications of what they're doing. And to the extent we can do that, I think we'll make real progress.
That's a great point. And I was just going to add that, higher education campuses, we have the luxury of not having to always find the answer to questions, but raising the questions for the sake of asking the question. So, if you have students who want to look into expanded Scope 3 emissions, or if you think that it would be, a useful exercise to do, but you're not sure how you'll include that in your reporting, it's okay, I think, to go ahead and invest some time in gathering enough data that you can put the question out to your campus community. Is it worthwhile for us to include this new information in our continued inventory? Do we have enough people power to go back and do this research to add it to our baseline? What would be the value of doing so? Those are questions that really tie in with what Jono's saying, and involving people in the conversation of greenhouse gas emissions in a way that brings that technical information down to a really personal level. So it's another option to consider, is that not every research project needs to end in a new baseline or a new data point for your greenhouse gas inventory. Sometimes it's just good for education's sake. I want to move us a little bit into some technical questions. There were some great technical questions that folks asked. Let's see. So, Jenn, there was a couple of questions for you. Actually, Jenn, I'm going to save your questions for just a minute. Ben, I have a question for you. Someone wanted to know how we can address the very complex issue of organizations double counting Scope 3 emissions. So, for instance, if we look at that, if we were to go back to that image again of the upstream and downstream activities, at what point does my downstream end and your upstream begin? How do we address that?
Yeah, it's a great question. That comes up a lot. So, I mean, Scope 3 is by definition double counting because it's another organization's emissions. So, if every organization in the world accounted for its Scope 1 emissions, then you wouldn't require, or accounted for the Scope 1, 2, and 3, yeah, you'd get a lot of double counting, as you say. But when you're looking at one organization in isolation, so you're looking at one particular college or university and the impact of their activities through the value chain, so in terms of what they buy and what they sell or what their activities are, the issue of double counting doesn't really come up necessarily for a specific organization. You're not, the idea of this isn't to take all the universities as Scope 1, 2, and 3, all organizations Scope 1, 2, and 3, and add them together to calculate what the total emissions are of the US or of the world, for example, because that would result in double counting. But that's not really the aim here. So the double counting issue doesn't really affect how you'd report your Scope 3 emissions in this sense. I mean, that if you buy something from, say, Office Depot, you buy some office supplies from Office Depot, and they report their Scope 1 emissions. Part of that Scope 1 emissions is associated with what you buy from them. So you're sort of taking a responsibility for that portion that you purchase. But that's okay. So I don't know if that makes sense. It's quite a difficult one to explain, but Scope 3 basically is by definition double counting. But if you're looking at one organization and its value chain, then you don't need to worry about the double counting issue, if that makes sense.
Great, thanks, Ben. Anyone else have anything to add to that? This is kind of related to double counting. A question for Jono. Someone wanted to know if you counted students who take online courses when you were doing your travel analysis. And Jono, I don't know if you did that or not, but I think that's an interesting question in general about as we campuses move towards offering more online courses, how that changes sort of the scope of our emissions responsibility.
Yes, we're Florida legislature's increasing pressure to develop online courses, and I think they're even discussing an entire online college in the state university system. I don't think we have any measurable online education at this point. We're a small college of about 800 with a great student-faculty ratio, small classes, and so we haven't really encountered that problem yet.
Any other double? Go ahead, Jen. I think you might be answering the question that I was going to ask.
Oh, well, maybe not. It was just sort of taking on to the past one, which is that sort of move toward online education is one of the reasons why you may have noticed in the slide about kind of things that we're looking at including in the future. IT is definitely on that target list because it does seem to be a significant and increasing potential source of emissions or impact. Yeah, almost there. One more, maybe. Yeah. So, nope, you're right there. Yeah, it was just those are some of the things that we're looking at as quickly as we can because we think those are some of the highest impact Scope 3 sources for colleges and universities. And they obviously can be reorganized to sort of line up with those categories. They're organized a little differently than the categories in Ben's slide in the GHG protocol methodology, but they kind of comport to different pieces of those categories.
Jen, is the online inventory pilot closed at this point?
The online inventory pilot. No. Well, so what we're doing is we will be, you could look at it as piloting or beta testing. We'll be doing that starting mid-October, at the ACU conference and moving forward. So because we've still been building this online platform, which has taken, can I just say, forever, we haven't been piloting it with anyone yet. And so that will, for the online campus carbon calculator, that will begin in October. The Chef's tool we have been piloting, that is already online. That's the Life Cycle Dining Services tool. And we do still welcome schools to pilot that tool in beta format and anyone can just get in touch with me to get information about that. We would be very happy to have schools pilot that.
Great, and we can send out some information in the email to all the attendees and folks who registered about how to be involved if they're interested. Let's see, a couple of other good questions, but we're getting close to the end of our time. Jen, another technical question from you related to something that a lot of campuses do choose to report on, PCC campuses, which is solid waste. So someone asked about why solid waste has gone up so much in the past years. This person was commenting that their solid waste waste emissions increase greatly between inventories, even though they feel that the volume of their waste stayed about the same. So I'm just wondering if you can comment on the emissions increase for solid waste in particular.
Yeah, what I would like to do is send out, we're going to have very detailed documentation around that with the updated version of the calculator. The short answer is that the emissions factors for solid waste have always been taken from EPA, an EPA report that was done, I want to say originally back in 2004, 2006, and they just recently updated it. And when they updated it, the emissions factors for the different types of waste changed dramatically, partly because the measurement seemed to, the methodologies seemed to have gotten more precise, partly because the solid waste industry has changed with, increased legislation around methane capture and other things. But I will also say that to some degree, that's a question that we're still kind of trying to figure out based on these EPA reports. Because you get the numbers and you get the methodology, but there's not always a good kind of explanation or questioning for why those emissions factors change drastically. They're just measured and, reported and included. So I hope to get you more specific and a more specific and better answer soon. Is the short.
It sounds like a good research question for some universities to take on. If anyone is
really interesting and sort of mind-blowing.
So I feel about a lot of this information. I do want to point out before we finish here in a few minutes that tomorrow the monthly ACU PCC implementer, our monthly newsletter, comes out, and I recently did an analysis of what PCC signatories have submitted for their Scope 3 custom sources, and that information was just so interesting to me. There was a lot of double counting, or it was hard to see why people had kind of segmented out their custom sources the way they had. But the other thing that was very interesting was just looking at how data compared from year to year. So as people were doing those custom Scope 3 sources, and a large percentage of schools do solid waste, it was very interesting to see the numbers fluctuate so much from year to year. So, I'm at a qualitative level. I'd love at some point for us to do some more research with signatories on their experience with that and what insights they've gained, as they've completed more than just the first one or two inventories and really started to dig into that process. We're almost out of time, but I wanted to just end with a final question for the panelists, which is, this is a topic that I think can be very scary for campuses. Gosh, do we really want to take on, we already do so much with sustainability and with our reporting, do we really want to take on more? And I think I'd like to maybe throw out to the panelists a reframing of that question and ask you each to just comment briefly on, why you think this topic is important and also exciting in the context of campus sustainability.
Well, this is Jen. Maybe if I go first, I can skate with an easy answer. But the thing that occurs to me is that in some ways, the Scope 3 sources give us many more opportunities to do what we alluded to a little earlier, which is tie all of this measurement to individual choices and individual behavior and daily life. So if you're doing your Scope 1 emissions, that's all it can be very sort of black box. It happens behind the scenes and you don't have a lot of choice over how the campus runs its plant or where it gets its electricity. But when you start looking at Scope 3 stuff, that's often more related to individual daily behavior. It's the materials that you use, it's your food, it's all of those things. And so I guess that's one, the ability to really kind of take those, not the carbon message home necessarily, the numerical message, but the sustainability message home. I think that's one really important reason that the Scope 3 stuff gives us opportunities to start new conversations or to come at conversations we've been trying to start from different angles that maybe can click with people where it hasn't before.
This is Jono, and I think Ben alluded to the fact that for colleges, our main downstream product is graduates. I suppose we sell some sweatshirts and some publications, but primarily I think everyone, students, faculty, the administration, understand that it's those upstream choices that Jenn alluded to that are so crucial, and that's really what's driving everything. So I think the ability to stop obsessing so much about the decisions that are made on the campus and look more at the off-campus implications of what we're doing and how those choices could change. I think that's exciting. And I think the other piece of it is that, you know, when we first started, we had no idea how to gather a lot of this information. We've changed forms. We've worked with our physical plant and some of our accounting people to make it easier to get this information. So I think the total amount of time we're spending on actually collecting the information is staying about the same. So even though more is being asked of us, we've developed some real efficiencies in the basic questions, and I think people are really intrigued with, you know, what are the energy implications of bringing a tomato to campus, and how do we address those? Yeah,
and I completely agree with everything that's just been said, and they've covered a lot of the points that I was going to cover as well. And like I said, it's just really taking a holistic view, really, of any organization or any person's climate change impact. So it's, you know, it's not just the fuel in the car that you drive, but like you say, it's it's all the purchases that you make. There's so many sort of other elements that are involved when you start thinking about it in a more holistic way, and understanding like this sort of life cycle thinking, really, the idea that any product that has been manufactured has used energy and therefore has carbon associated with its manufacture. So the idea of trying to drive down emissions from all of those little pieces can add up to a huge difference. And it's that concept that the responsibility and the opportunity to affect change doesn't stop at the campus gates, is sort of an important concept, really, to take home, and that applies to so many different environmental impacts, and it's a very valuable lesson to understand.
Great. Well, thank you so much to all the presenters. This was a very helpful resource to have for PCC signatories and others who work on greenhouse gas reporting on campus. Be on the lookout tomorrow. That'll be September 2012 for the PCC implementer on the same topic, more information about Scope 3 reporting, and we will send out a recording of this webinar and the PowerPoint slides to all attendees. Thanks so much for attending, and have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Goodbye.